Your broadcast.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We are so glad that you're here and that you're taking time to talk with us about supporting immigrant survivors through the U Visa program. We are working together to learn more about this area of advocacy, and we know that you all will be bringing really important ideas and questions to this conversation. So please do feel free to use the chat throughout our time together, and we will have questions and answers. Hopefully we'll have answers for you at the end of our workshop today. We are working in partnership here in Pennsylvania to support immigrant victims through the federal U Visa program. My name is Donna Greco. I'm the policy director at the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape, and I'm so grateful to join you today and to join these wonderful colleagues, and I will allow them to introduce themselves.
I'll go. Hi, everyone. My name is Deanna Dyer. I work in close partnership with Donna at the Pennsylvania Coalition on Rape. I am with the sister coalition, which is the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I've had the opportunity to work alongside domestic violence advocates and survivors for a number of years, about 16 years now, and have had the opportunity to work closely with immigrant survivors as well. And so join Donna in thanking you all for joining us. I'll turn it over to Whitney.
My name is Whitney Phelps, and I am the managing attorney of community programs at Pennsylvania Immigration Resource Center. And part of community programs is our Immigrant Survivors Project, where we specifically represent immigrant survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking.
Wonderful. I'm just going to enlarge these slides here. And I believe we are starting with a poll question so that we can learn more about you all as participants and the roles you're bringing and the expertise you're bringing to this time together. We know that everyone plays a really important role and everyone has a piece of the puzzle here, whether you're a victim service provider, an attorney advocating on behalf of immigrant survivors, law enforcement officer, district attorney, perhaps you're working in government relations or another really important role in the community. So thanks for taking time to respond to our poll.
And Donna, I just want to be sure that folks saw the instructions in the chat that on the left side of your screen is a little box that says polls. So if you click that, then you can vote on the poll question.
And it looks like maybe we're having some people slowly trickle in, but mostly victim service agencies. Sorry, I'm echoing. We've got some legal service providers and then people who classify themselves as healthcare.
So thank you for taking time to respond to the poll. Please do share your expertise and your questions and ideas in the chat throughout the presentation. We're going to have another poll question next. We are really curious to know how familiar you are with the U visa program. I know for many of us, we are just learning about the U visa program and how we can help immigrant survivors access those important resources and rights. And others may have wonderful expertise in that program to share, and we're grateful for that too. And thank you for hanging on with us while we're working out some screen sharing glitches. I hope you can see these slides pretty well now. And I'm hearing from Deanna that it is better. So thank you for your patience, and thank you, Deanna.
And Donna, we have one response in the chat that someone is familiar with the U visa program.
Okay. So Deanna, Whitney, and I are so grateful to be working together on this important advocacy priority to really expand immigrant survivors' access to the U visa program. And we came together united by this goal to really improve systems and to work in partnership with each other and a number of other colleagues that are joining us throughout the state. And we're just so grateful to share where we're at with this process, what we're learning, and how you all can also get involved in systems change, advocating on behalf of immigrant survivors in your communities. So you may know that sexual assault, domestic violence, and trafficking affect immigrant victims and survivors in unique and complex ways. We know that these crimes cut across all socioeconomic and geographic boundaries, but we also know that immigrant survivors are uniquely impacted. From the sexual assault standpoint, we know in general sexual assault is underreported, and we know for immigrant communities it's even more so because immigrant survivors face so many barriers in coming forward and getting the help they need, knowing what their rights and resources are. We know that sexual assault is often the reason that people are fleeing and coming to the U.S. for safety and refuge. We know that in that process they are vulnerable to sexual assault and sexual violence. while emigrating. We also know that in the United States, immigrant survivors that are undocumented are at even higher risk of sexual violence, given just the risk factors for exploitation, abuse, and harm, and fear of deportation, fear of retaliation, and ongoing violence. And so our work together is really about reducing those barriers, addressing those barriers, and supporting the safety and rights of immigrant victims. So we are working together across the state to really enhance survivors' access to this important program. And there is a growing coalition of advocates throughout the state from a number of organizations, farm workers, Project, PCADV, of course, PERC, PCAR, Nationality Service Center, and many other organizations are coming together to address these risk factors and to help immigrant victims leverage their rights. I know Deanna was going to share with you about the unique impacts of domestic violence among immigrant communities.
Yes, thanks, Donna. I think that a lot of what you mentioned in terms of additional barriers that impact victims of sexual assault are true for victims of domestic violence as well, who are also immigrants. Many of the barriers that you talked about, including fear of deportation, as well as language barriers, whether that language barrier creates difficulty accessing victim service providers. There's also often a culture of fear of contacting the police that sort of hinges around that fear of deportation, and particularly in relationships that involve domestic violence. Oftentimes, threats of deportation are used strategically to influence victims to stay in an abusive relationship. And just to sort of put into context how prevalent domestic violence is among the immigrant community, there was a study done in New York City that found that 51% of intimate partner homicide victims were foreign born. There was another study that found that 48% of Latinas reported that their partner's violence against them increased since they immigrated to the United States. And there was even another study done of immigrant Korean women who reported, 60% of them reported that their partners behaved in abusive ways towards them. So domestic violence is incredibly prevalent within the immigrant community, and much of it is due to these unique barriers to immigrant survivors. I think Whitney was going to talk about some additional barriers as well.
Thanks, Deanna. So as obviously has been mentioned previously, the threat of deportation and ultimately family separation is a huge barrier for reporting. There is this underlying fear that if you report to the police, that the police will come and nothing will be necessarily done in the case that you called about, but that you would be picked up by ICE and potentially put into detention and then into removal proceedings. There's the anti-immigrant sentiment that has increased over the last 5-6 years, and the discrimination that immigrants face just generally within society. I would also say that another big fear is that there's a fear to report because police in home countries, so for an immigrant who's coming from a home country where police are not safe, they don't necessarily come to the United States knowing and understanding that in the United States police operate differently. They are not seen as helpers necessarily, but also as a source of danger and fear. So Donna, do we want to go to the next slide? So Yeah, so definitely in the chat, please share what impacts interpersonal violence that you've seen or has had on immigrants in your communities. So Congress created the it's a U non-immigrant visa. We call it a U visa for short. It was created with the passage of the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act, which included the Battered Immigrant Women's Protection Act in October of 2000. The legislation was intended to strengthen the ability of law enforcement agencies to investigate and prosecute cases of domestic violence, sexual assault, trafficking, and other serious crimes. So there is an actual list of crimes that qualify for U non-immigrant status. It's a little bit outside of the scope of what we want to discuss today, but just so that you have that in the back of your mind. And really the intent was to eliminate some of these barriers or lessen some of these barriers by saying we're going to provide you this protection against deportation if you help with the investigation or prosecution of these criminal activities. So part of this process, the initial step is really kind of the focus of what we're talking about here is the certification process. There is a form, it's Form I-918 Supplement B, and it has to be used in all cases. So if you're a law enforcement officer, if you work for the district attorney's office, or if you work in some other certifying agency and you're ever asked about a certification, you just be aware that there is a specific form that has to be used in all of these cases. And that is the I-918 Supplement B. So in order for somebody to qualify, they have to be the victim of a qualifying crime. Again, there is a specific list. They have to possess information regarding what happened during that criminal activity, and they have to agree to be helpful or cooperative with either law enforcement or with the prosecution of the case. And they have to show that they've suffered substantial harm. So in the context that we're talking about with domestic violence and sexual assault, the proof of substantial harm is pretty easily demonstrated. To give you all an idea of who certifying agencies are, so it's federal, state, local law enforcement, so police at all levels, federal, state, and local prosecutors' offices, federal, state, and local judges. That can include PFA judges. Federal, state, and local family protective services, so CYS. And in the labor context, so where a crime is committed in the context of labor, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, federal and state departments of labor, and other investigating, they leave it open, other investigating agencies. So that certification is then submitted with the application for U non-immigrant status to USCIS. If it's approved, the U visa is valid for 4 years and again provides a means to become a lawful permanent resident, and during that time protection from deportation and work authorization, which, as you can imagine, for somebody who's here in the United States, work authorization is one of the most important means to provide stability to the immigrant and their family. So some consistent barriers that we see with the certification process, probably the most common is just a lack of understanding or awareness of what a U visa is and what the certification is and what it means to certify. So if you're a member of one of these certifying agencies and you're approached about a U visa certification, you may not know what a U visa is. You may not know what it means if you sign the certification. One of the most important things that I always tell anybody in a law enforcement agency or district attorney's office, as those are the most common areas that I tend to work with, you're not giving them a visa. You're just saying this person was the victim of the crime. They knew, they have information about it. They were helpful. And they have not said that they're not going to be helpful in the future. And I from my limited knowledge or experience with the case, they've suffered harm as a result. Again, there's a lot of inconsistency as well in how certifications are approached. So we don't have straightforward rules regarding when time, like, is there a time frame in which you need to have the certification signed? Who the certifier is actually spelled out within the regulations. It does need to be the head of an agency, but we sometimes see, and actually at PERC, we just had a case that came in that was signed by someone who technically isn't the head of an agency. So again, just an inconsistency in how the certification process is handled. Sometimes also there's the lack of access to the required information that we would need as advocates. So lack of access to police reports or court documents. And these barriers have pretty significant effects on the immigrant survivor and their families, and that if you can't get the certification, you do not have access to non-immigrant status. So the certification is a required step in this process. And if you don't have that certification, you can't move forward with that application. And because of things like, you'll see on this slide, timeframes, and the limited number of visas, because of how Congress set this program up, there are only 10,000 visas available every year. And what that means is we have a huge backlog in cases where I think our processing times are upwards of 4 years right now, where you're waiting for about 4 years to get a decision on your case. And that means 4 years without any level of protection, although we are starting to see some changes in that. And again, 4 years without work authorization. So those are pretty significant barriers for a family of immigrants. Again, we are seeing some changes. So we're getting bona fide determinations much sooner now, thank goodness. And that means work authorizations are now available much sooner, but still waiting that, 4 years to get final decisions. And I will hand off to Deanna and Donna.
So grateful for your expertise and your direct service and advocacy with immigrant survivors. And there are so many barriers that we're trying to address together. We know that the U visa program really does offer survivors safety and stability for themselves, for their loved ones, for their families, and this benefits all of us in our communities throughout the Commonwealth. And we also know that the U visa program supports investigation and prosecution of violent crime, which also increases the safety of our communities. So we know that we have a lot of work to do to reduce these barriers, and together that we can definitely make progress. Pennsylvania has some unique strengths that I think are tremendous resources for us. We have a very strong victim service infrastructure. We have collaborative teams at the local level, working across advocacy, prosecution, law enforcement, medical providers, legal advocates, and making sure that we're continuing those collaborations in service of immigrant survivors is so critical, given what Whitney just shared with all of the barriers that we have. We also have the new Department of Community Engagement within the Pennsylvania State Police that is looking at improving relationships across law enforcement and community members, and we think that's a tremendous opportunity and very relevant to this discussion together. We also know that there are many legal resources, Whitney being one tremendous legal resource. We also know that PCAR and PCADV also have attorneys that can help support immigrant victims through this process. So just as important it is for us to understand the many barriers and to address them, we also really have the opportunity and the potential to address them together with the unique strengths that we have here in the Commonwealth. And those strengths also include you all who are here today with us, learning about the program and already doing wonderful work in your communities in service of immigrant survivors. We hoped that you would continue to use the chat to engage with each other and share the specific strengths and barriers that you're seeing in your community related to what Whitney shared about the certification process. Are people aware of the U visa program? Are immigrant survivors facing similar barriers he described, or maybe something different? And also the strengths that you're seeing in your community, whether those are partnerships with law enforcement who care and know that immigrant survivors need these protections. We know things are working well also in communities throughout the state, and we'd be so grateful to hear from you in the chat about that. Now I am going to turn it over to Deanna, who's going to share information from other state models.
Thank you so much, Donna. Just as Whitney and Donna pointed out, there are a lot of strengths, in Pennsylvania and also with this program at the federal level, and there are some barriers as well, which Whitney talked about. And I see Denise has a question in the chat that asks about one of those barriers, which is the cap on how many U visas can actually be granted each year. And Denise's question is about whether or not there has been efforts from immigration organizations at the federal level to increase that cap. And the answer is yes, absolutely. And for a long time, particularly the Asian Pacific Islander Institute on Gender-Based Violence has really been leading the effort at the intersection of domestic and sexual violence and immigrant policy or immigration policy. There was a big push to get it included in this huge Build Back Better infrastructure, which is a social infrastructure plan. Unfortunately, that may not happen, but absolutely there are ongoing efforts to do that. And I can put the name of the organization that's really taking the lead on that effort. That's one of the organizations that we have consulted with. Donna mentioned that there's a group of us, 8 or more different organizations who all have sort of unique areas of expertise that intersect around this issue. And one of the things that we did when we got together is to look at the strengths and the barriers and look to our federal partners to see what work they've been doing, exactly like Denise just asked, and then to see what we could do at the state level. So the way we started doing that is to look to see what have other states done and what have they done well that could help address some of the barriers that we see. So this is a list of the states that we really took a deep dive into their policies. We also reached out to victim service organizations within those states to see how those policies are being implemented. And I just want to highlight a couple of them that we're really looking at to pull from, and I think Donna's going to jump in to a little bit more detail about the components that we're hoping to get implemented here in Pennsylvania to strengthen the protection that U visas can offer to immigrant survivors of violence. The California law, for example, has this provision around that requirement that Whitney talked about, that law enforcement has to find that the victim has been helpful. And so that sometimes becomes a barrier for victims when, when possibly, someone could, a certifying agency could say that they weren't helpful. So what California has done to help strengthen that protection and remove that barrier is they've created a presumption that all immigrant victims are helpful unless there are certain things that have occurred. So it kind of creates this starting point of assuming that the victim has been helpful, and that's a way to help overcome one of those barriers. Is just kind of when we're looking at whether or not a victim has been helpful, where's our starting point? So California's law says your starting point has to assume that victims are helpful. So that's a provision that we think is strength that we're hoping to pull into Pennsylvania's law. Around the timeframes of when a certifying organization can sort of finish the paperwork to give to a victim that they need for obtaining a U visa. excuse me, Indiana has a requirement that that certification has to either be signed or declined by law enforcement within 15 days. So, you know, we looked to Indiana for that provision and thought that that was something strong that we may want to include. Indiana also has a provision, excuse me, my allergies. Let me take a sip of water. Indiana also has a provision around notification. So Indiana requires that victims be provided with information about the U visa process. It actually gives an affirmative duty to law enforcement to make victims aware that this is a form of protection that is available to them. So that's another strength that we saw that we pulled from by looking at other states. And then finally, I'll just say that one of the barriers that we experience is just not having a good assessment of, you know, what the status is across the state and across the country. So Virginia, in their law, they have a provision that addresses that by providing access to good data. And so what they require is that agencies have to publicize their certification procedures and also provide written explanation of any denials. So, you know, that kind of access to data and reporting requirement is something that we think could be helpful here in Pennsylvania as well. And I think Donna's going to dive into a little bit more of those core components that we're hoping to get into the Pennsylvania statute. And so, John, if you could unmute Donna, she can take it away.
Thank you, Deanna. So in Pennsylvania, as Deanna mentioned, we are in the process of drafting legislation by drawing from the strengths in other state models. So we have honed in on these core components that we feel will be important to carry forward in our work in Pennsylvania with the General Assembly. You heard from Whitney that currently there really is not a lot of consistency in terms of the time frame that victims can expect once they start the certification process. So we know that in other states, this is something that is very important, and just arriving at more consistency across the Commonwealth will serve victims and survivors, and also it helps us to not lose important evidence. The longer that victims and survivors are needing to wait, the more vulnerable the evidence might be from an investigative perspective among law enforcement and district attorneys. We've also heard that designating a specific certifying agent would be beneficial to provide more clarity and transparency. Who are the folks at the local level that are trained and have the authority to certify the petitions? That is something that we see could be beneficial in addressing some of the barriers currently with lack of awareness and sometimes lack of training and knowledge about the U visa program and how to, again, help survivors navigate it. With that, we feel that training would be really important, not only for law enforcement and district attorneys, but also for victim service providers, advocates around the state, and our many community partners that work with survivors, work with immigrant communities, play a role in their healthcare, mental health care, and really just the diverse sort of settings and folks that are working with immigrant survivors. We feel training is definitely something that would improve the certification process overall. You heard from Deanna about the importance of limiting the factors in the certification process and making sure that helpfulness is understood and that trauma is also understood. We know that sometimes trauma and a victim's reaction to that trauma may be misunderstood and may be misperceived as being unhelpful. We know that the many barriers for victims in seeking safety can make it look like they're not being forthcoming or they're not being cooperative. And we know that really is not true. We know that it's important to limit those factors, and again, through training everyone to understand the perspective of immigrant survivors and the impacts of trauma in their lives. With that, we feel it's really important to protect victims' personal information. We heard earlier from Whitney that fear of retaliation, fear of deportation, fear of losing one's child, these are all incredibly stressful barriers. We want to make sure that victims' personal information is never shared inappropriately that would jeopardize their safety and their rights. With that, we know that victims should be made aware of those rights and those services that are there to support them locally, whether it's a domestic violence, a rape crisis center, a legal advocate, and other services that are there to help immigrant victims and their loved ones. We also know there are important state rights that all victims of crime have in Pennsylvania. That should also be made available and known to immigrant victims. And then they also have federal rights that they should be made aware of and the advocates that can help them access those rights. And finally, we are learning from each other as we're going through this process the importance of collaboration. And we know that when we're collaborating with each other, we are serving victims and survivors best. So we feel that legislation should help us gather in a more way to continue to work together in strengthening the U visa program within Pennsylvania. Now I believe Deanna and Whitney are going to help share some ideas of how you all can get involved. So if we could take Deanna off of mute, please, John. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna. As you can imagine, like most things, you know, working towards making policy change, the more voices behind the advocacy, the stronger our chances of actually getting some of these important barriers removed become. So, you know, we would, as Donna mentioned, we would love for you to join us. And a couple things that you can start with is just by talking with your colleagues. You know, often we meet with advocates who don't know about the U visa program or don't know about barriers within the U visa program. So you can take, you know, what you've learned hopefully in your time here with us today and take that information back to your colleagues within your own agency and outside your agency as well, right? So we know that law enforcement and district attorneys and prosecutors, they're some of the key players in ensuring that the U visa program works effectively and works well for the protection of victims. So in those conversations that you're having with outside partners, including law enforcement and district attorneys, this is something that you can talk about as well, you know, helping them understand what a key component the U visa program is to victim safety. I think Whitney's going to talk a bit about partnering with immigrant organizations as well.
Thanks, Deanna. So again, we really barely touched on like what is a U visa, how does this process work, what's required. We really didn't talk a whole lot in detail on that. So if you do have any questions, like please reach out to one of the many really wonderful immigration legal service providers that are here in the state of Pennsylvania. PERC is one of them. We also at PERC have our ESON network, which is the Immigrant Survivors Advocate Network, which is a group of 37 domestic violence and sexual assault service agencies that have access to us for questions, training, and many different things. So for those of you who are a member of a victim service provider, like check and see if you are an ESON member. If you want to have more information, you can definitely reach out to myself, and I'd be happy to direct you. We, as lawyers and advocates, really want to help educate our communities regarding this process and all the requirements that exist. So we're more than happy to talk to any of you about what's required and how you can be helpful if you do know someone, if you know an immigrant survivor who might qualify for a U visa. And I would say too, as we have these conversations, let's try to also keep in mind that immigrant survivors really are coming from a really unique perspective, in that they have a lot of ongoing fears of law enforcement that we wouldn't traditionally see within our US citizen communities, whether that be based on their experience of law enforcement in their home countries, or just the general fear that fear of the unknown here in the United States. So if you're working with a victim service agency and you know that one of the survivors that you're working with is an immigrant, maybe ask how you can be helpful in reporting these crimes. Could you go with them? Is there a way that you could make reporting a little more comfortable for them? So definitely be asking those questions in those just sort of initial conversations that you're having with clients, and just making sure that they are aware that this is a program that exists, and it does exist to help provide them with certain protections. And again, like, the whole context of the U visa is to provide protections to immigrants and also to those family members. If we lose an immigrant parent who maybe has US citizen children, the consequences for those USC children are going to be extremely significant as well. So we want to always be thinking about the family member or the family unit as a whole in having some of these conversations. So I'll pass it off to Donna to wrap it up. And if you guys have questions, again, feel free to reach out to us in the chat.
Thanks, Whitney. This is Deanna. I'm going to round us off here. And just say, as I've mentioned, and as Donna has mentioned, we are a growing coalition, a growing group of us. I mentioned there are at least 8 different organizations who are working on this, and we know you all, who I think primarily reported from the poll, come from victim service providers, have a unique perspective to offer as well in terms of what barriers you're seeing that the immigrant survivors that you're working with are facing. So if you have interest in joining our coalition, our contact information is going to be on the following slide. Please feel free to reach out to us. Also, as you all know, we're working on putting together a bill that we can hopefully get passed into law to strengthen some of the pieces that are helpful in Pennsylvania and to help remove some of those barriers. So another key way that you could be helpful is by engaging with your own members of federal Congress. I think many of you saw the link that I dropped in the chat that lists out some of those federal priorities, so you can reach out to your members of Congress in Washington, D.C. on those issues. And you can also reach out to your state representatives within the Pennsylvania General Assembly. Ensuring that your local electeds understand the importance of this program and the importance of protections for immigrant survivors is really the basis of how we're able to make change. So those are just some more ways that you can get involved. So now we're going to open it up for some Q&A. I'm just checking the chat for any additional comments. I think Denise mentioned another organization that's a great resource. There's a comment that this topic was really needed. So thank you for that. If you have any other questions, please, I think we have about 1 minute left, so feel free to drop it in the chat. Also, as I mentioned, this is how you can get in contact with myself or Donna at the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape, or Whitney, who, again, has that specific expertise on the U visa and sort of the nuts and bolts of how that works. So please feel free to reach out to us if you want more information about how you can get involved, or if you have any questions that are not coming to you now. We certainly appreciate all the time that you've spent with us together today. We hope that it was helpful for you. We're so glad to have you join us today. So thank you so much.